Hello, Comics Alternative fans. Before we start with the episode, we want to invite all of you to check out our Patreon campaign.
That's right. Go to www.patreon.com/comicsalternative for more details. There you'll find more information about the campaign and the cool rewards levels we have.
For as little as $1 a month, you can help us maintain good quality comics talk, and the more you contribute, the more perks you get.
These include monthly podcast episodes exclusive to Patreon supporters, as well as the chance to help us choose which books we review on the show. So be sure to visit www.patreon.com/comicsalternative and become one of our proud podcast patrons.
Yeah, and now on with the show.
This is the Comics Alternative, episode 140, a publisher spotlight on AdHouse Books.
This series presents information based in part on theory and conjecture. The producer's purpose is to suggest some possible explanations, but not necessarily the only ones, to the mysteries we will examine.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this episode, we have another publisher spotlight. This time, we turn our focus to recent releases from AdHouse. So they have a lot of really great titles this year that they've been putting out, and we're going to have a fun time discussing those. But before we get to that, we want to let all of our listeners know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the good folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off the cover price if you pre-order. All of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. Now, Andy, sometimes those specials are at 45% off cover price. Sometimes they're at 50% off cover price, but often you'll find discounts that are much more impressive than that.
Isn't that just crazy?
It's crazy.
It is. And one thing that's also crazy are the bundles that they have at DCB Service. If you've been buying your comics individually, don't be a sucker. Buy them in bundles.
Bundle.
Yeah, there's all kinds of great bundles here. There is a DC Kids bundle. There's a DC Returning series, new series. There's a Valiant bundle, a Vertigo bundle, and almost all of these are 50% off. So you're going to save a lot of money buying these bundles rather than individual comics.
Wow, that's crazy and whacked out.
It is crazy.
Yeah, but you may as well take advantage of Discount Comic Book Service's insanity. And to do that, go to their website, dcbservice.com. Please go there for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. We do. And after you do get your comics there, drop them a line and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
Yes, let them know.
Well, Andy, we got a lot to talk about on this episode, a publisher spotlight on AdHouse. But there are a few things that we need to talk about before we get to our discussion of those new titles.
Okay.
First and foremost is you, me, and Andy Kunka will be at Heroes Con this coming weekend. Now, this episode of the podcast will go up on Wednesday, and 2 days from there, Heroes Con begins. It's the 19th, 20th, and 21st in Charlotte, North Carolina, my hometown. And so I'll be there not only for Heroes Con, but also visiting my father and other family members. But we have a table there, and this is the first time we've tabled at a con.
That should be interesting.
Yeah.
And I've seen the table covering, and it looks pretty cool.
In fact, I'm going to put the table... Well, actually, by the time this goes up, I will have already put an image of the table covering up on our blog. I haven't put it up yet as of this recording, but I will. And we'll also have a banner, and of course, we have our business cards, which are also bookmarks. And so, not only will we bring all of the visuals there, we're going to bring ourselves. So the 3 guys with PhDs are going to be there. And we're at Artists Alley, table 406. So that's AA 406. We're easy to find on the floor. So if you're in the area, if you plan on coming to the con, please be sure and drop by and say, hey, I listened to you guys.
Yeah, we really would love to see you and, hang out with us, talk for a little bit, and, just see what see what we have to offer.
Yeah. And, another thing to look forward to at the con, both Andy Kunka and I are going to be on a panel on Friday. And I'm glad it's Friday. We're going to go ahead and get that out of the way, and then we can enjoy the rest of the con. But we're going to be on a panel titled Teaching Comics Through a Historical Context. And they describe it on the Heroes Con website as whether it is Watchmen, Mouse, Batman, or Spider-Man, all comics are a representation of the time of their creation. Join us as we consider how best to put comics in a historical context. So Andy and I will both be on the panel, along with Will Allred, Tom Hienches, Brian Pruaka, and moderated by Sean Doughty. That's going to be a fun time. I look forward to talking about comics in history and the teaching of that.
Cool. I'll have to check that panel out.
Yeah, I'm really excited about this, Andy. Not only is this Heroes Con, which is a great con, and not only is this the first time that we're going to have a table at a con, but there are going to be some incredible creators there, and we're going to get tons of interviews, I'm hoping, from this.
I think so. I've looked at the guest list, too, and it's very impressive.
Mm-hmm. Now, another bit of news we want to share with all of our listeners is that we have a brand new podcast patron. And this is someone who, if you listen to the Comics Alternative, the name should sound familiar. The new patron is Daniel White. And if you're thinking, where have I heard the name Daniel White and the Comics Alternative together before? If you go back and listen to episode 118, which came out in early January, I think it was our second show of this year, you'll find that Kunka and I reviewed Daniel White's self-published mini-comic 1976. And we were both bowled away by that book. Daniel sent us copies. And I remember it being difficult to discuss on a podcast. If we had a video podcast, it would be a lot easier. But the thing that Daniel does with his visuals, it's hard to put into words. It's an experience that you have to actually look at. And in fact, Daniel has his own Patreon campaign, and so you can check out some of the work that he does and support him. You can find his Patreon campaign if you go to patreon.com/birdsinboxes. So go there and support him. But we definitely want to thank Daniel White for becoming our latest podcast patron. And he joins the noble ranks of others such as Christopher Michael, Paul Lay, Salgood Sam, Michael Norhale, Tom Matthews, Don Witzel, Simon Bilsby, David Campbell, and Rainer Koshnick. So Daniel and the rest of the guys, thank you very much for becoming podcast patrons.
Yeah, we thank you guys for your support. We really appreciate it.
Yeah, and we have other patrons on Patreon as well who support us at, let's say, a $1 or $2 level. Now, according to our levels, they're not officially podcast patrons, but we also want to thank them as well. I mean, just supporting us for $1 a month does go a long way. So thank you guys for doing that.
Yep. Thanks very much. Everything helps.
Mm-hmm. Other news, Andy? We've gotten some listener mail.
Ooh.
Mail time.
Ooh, the mail's here. That means we get to see our old friend, Mailbox.
Our first listener mail is from someone who's actually written us before, and this is Greg Hassa. He's down in South Africa, and he is responding to a show from a few weeks ago. We did a preview show. He says, I was listening to your previews episode and would like to take issue with your comments about Kevin Smith. When it comes to podcasting, Kevin Smith is no dabbler, and I guess he's referring to my comments. Kevin Smith has been podcasting since 2007. Since 2010, Smith has run a podcasting network, smodcast.com. That said, when it comes to films, Kevin Smith is a dabbler. He is the first to admit this. P.S. I would also buy a large John Hodgman action figure, and he gives me a link to where the Judge John Hodgman website is. And then Gary wraps up by saying, otherwise, thanks for the excellent work, Gary Hasse. So, Gary, thank you again for the email. And, I responded to Gary. I didn't go back to listen to the show. I probably did use the word dabbler. Did I? Do you remember?
I have a vague recollection of just you mentioning Smith, but I don't remember that precise word.
Yeah. Now, saying he's a dabbler in film is, I don't know. I don't buy that because this is a guy who made his name in film, whether you like him or not, and however deprecating Kevin Smith might be, he's a filmmaker. Now, he also could be a podcaster, but I think one of the things that may be a better way of explaining my reaction to seeing him and what's his colleague's name? I can't remember. Silent Bob and
Jay and Silent Bob.
Jay, yeah, I'm blanking. Yeah. But one of my reactions to that is generated by the fact that these guys are celebrities, right? So a celebrity who becomes a podcaster, that's easy. To become a celebrity by first being a podcaster, that's a little different. So when you're talking about people like Kevin Smith, Ira Glass, and others who are already established in other media, then becoming podcasters, nothing wrong with it. But if you're going to start a series of podcasting bobbleheads, why don't you start with someone who is an actual starting off, getting known for being primarily a podcaster?
Such as?
I don't know. I know that there are a lot of...
I thought you were going to say the two guys.
Oh, such as the two guys with PhDs talking about comics. Yeah, exactly. I wasn't going to blow my own horn there, but no, I mean, there are examples of very famous podcasters who have become famous because they podcast. That would be easier game for me, or it would make more sense for that company creating the bobbleheads. Anyway, so thank you very much, Greg, for your email. We appreciate that. And Andy, we also got email from one of the creators we discussed on our last webcomic show.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Sam Costello. He wrote us and said, hey guys, thanks so much for the extensive and fantastic review of my comic, Split Lip. It's always gratifying when someone takes notice of the series and appreciates it, but for you to spend so much time with the stories, apply so much thought to them, and to read them in such depth is really wonderful. I really appreciated your comments, the praise, of course, but also the critiques. I always appreciate considered, constructive feedback that can help me improve my work, and I found your thoughts valuable. It can be a struggle to find an audience for my kind of horror. No zombies or vampires, no comic twists, more cerebral than visceral. So I'm always so happy to hear from people for whom it resonates. And then he wraps up by saying, I have a new book coming out later this summer, and that's good news. And I'd be glad to send you some copies if you'd like. If you ever do interviews, I'd be really happy to do one. If neither of those things make sense for how you guys want to work, I totally understand. Just want to offer. Thanks again and best of luck, Sam Costello. So not only does he write a great letter, but he is very generous.
Yeah, well, Sam, that is really a nice letter, and we're pleased to discuss your work. We both enjoyed it, and hopefully someone will hear the podcast and will be directed to your work, and hopefully they will enjoy it too.
Yeah, and if they want to find out all about Split Lip Comics, they can go to our June webcomics episode, and we do have click-throughs. We have links to Split Lip Comics, so see what Andy and I were praising, what all the talk is about. Great stuff.
Yeah.
And, we got one more message that I would like to share with our listeners, and this occurred on Twitter over the weekend. Someone who's been following us for quite a while, because I see his tweets often. He communicates with us every now and again. His name is Zach. He goes by Zach Fig on Twitter, and that's one word, ZACKFIG. And he sent us a tweet yesterday that said, since you guys are/were teachers, what are your thoughts on this? And he sends a link to a story that appeared in the online Redlands Daily Facts in the education section. And I looked at that, And I'm not going to read this whole article, but I'll mention the setup. It says, a Crafton Hills College student and her parents have complained to college administrators that graphic novels taught in an English course are pornographic and violent. Tara Schultz, 20, of Yucaipa, and I'm not sure how you pronounce that California city, Yucaipa. Anyway, Tara Schultz, her parents, and several friends on Thursday of this past week protested outside the campus administration building. 4 of the graphic novels discussed in the course depict nudity, sex, violence, and torture. They also contain obscenities. It was shocking, Schultz said. I didn't expect to open a book and see that graphic material within. I expected Batman and Robin, not pornography. The course was listed as a core course for Schultz, who is seeking an associate's degree in English. She is also seeking an associate's degree in American Sign Language. Now, the teacher of this class is someone named Ryan Bartlett. He's an associate professor of English at the college, and he taught that course, which is English 250. It was last semester. And some of the books that I think she objected to, the story goes on to reveal, were Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, Why the Last Man, Volume 1 by Brian K. Vaughan, The Sandman, Volume 2, The Doll's House by Neil Gaiman and various, and then Marjane Satrapi's Persepolis. This story in the Redlands Daily Facts concludes by saying, with a quote from Schultz, "At least get a warning on the books. At most, I would like the books eradicated from the system. I don't want them taught anymore. I don't want anyone else to have read this garbage."
Well, there's certainly a lot of things that we could discuss at a later time about that. I mean, we could do a whole show about that. And I know you and Andy have addressed this issue before on some of your podcasts. So it's that's one of those things that, again, it's a big topic for another time. But apparently it's still an issue. And I know that actually coming up at Heroes Con, we have one of the first panels that I want to go to is a panel on graphic novels and the library, which I know is going to feature an element about challenged books.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it is a highly charged and ripe topic for discussion. We won't go into that on this episode because we have enough to discuss today with all the AdHouse books. But I did think that it's worth mentioning, first off to say thanks, Zach, for getting in touch with us and, holding this conversation. We went back and forth yesterday via Twitter on this topic. And for getting in touch with us and letting us know about this. And also, though, I think it is good for us to just mention this news story on the Comics Alternative. And in fact, yesterday, which was June 13th, the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund even put up a story about this happening. So you can go to the CBLDF website and find out what they have to say. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, I mean, there's so many facets of this that really anger me, depress me, give me cause to pause and scratch my head. And I won't go into that. But one of them, though, I will mention is the fact that when Tara Schultz, and I don't want to tear into this young student, right? I mean, she has her tastes and aesthetics. She has her idea of what literature is or isn't, or she has her idea of what garbage and pornography may be. And I'm not going to address that. But when she said in that Redlands story that when she saw a course on graphic novels, she thought of Batman and Spider-Man. And, I mean, I think that set me off more than anything. It's like, okay, come on. There's more to comics than Batman and Spider-Man. And, in fact, a lot of Batman and Spider-Man stuff, that's going to be the garbage and pornographic stuff. I think that if she'd read into it, could be even worse than some of those books that she'd mentioned, like Satrapi and Bechdel.
Yeah, and too, Derek, I mean, this is one of those, unfortunately, it's one of those things that we have to continue to defend, and that is the legitimacy of the graphic novel format or the comics format. And a lot of people either forget or don't know graphic novels have won the Pulitzer Prize. Graphic novels have won the National Book Award. Scholarly work is constantly being done on graphic novels. It is a legitimate format.
Oh, yeah. And, if you're in any class, any literature class, whether it's graphic novel based or otherwise, and you don't like the reading material, then drop the class.
Yeah.
Don't stay in and start complaining and making the argument that the book should be eradicated from the reading list, And people have said the same thing about, let's say, Kate Chopin's The Awakening and, of course, with Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn. And I think that if you're in the same category as Adventures of Huckleberry Finn and The Awakening, that's great company to be in.
Yeah. Well, Zach, thanks for letting us know about that through Twitter. And, it is good that we hear from people about things like that because, it's not just reviewing books and things like that. I mean, this is a part of what's important to us too.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. So, Andy, you want to get into the fun stuff for this episode, to the AdHouse Books.
Yeah, let me take a nice deep breath because we got a lot of books to cover.
Okay, you can exhale.
Okay.
Well, Andy, we're gonna start as we did with our last publisher spotlight. If you remember when we were discussing the Conundrum books, I had a very brief interview with Andy Brown, who is the founder, editor, publisher of Conundrum, and I did the same thing with Chris Pitzer with our AdHouse show. So I had the pleasure of talking with him for a few minutes about the founding of AdHouse several years ago, the kind of things that he does, how it's grown. And so let's start by listening to that brief interview.
Okay.
I'm glad to have on the show Chris Pitzer, who is the publisher of AdHouse, and AdHouse is the subject of this episode's focus. It's a publisher spotlight on AdHouse. So, Chris, thank you for joining us on the Comics Alternative.
No, thanks for having us, Derek. We appreciate the spotlight that you're giving our imprint.
And, this is something that, at least in my book, is kind of a long time in coming. I know you guys have been around since 2002, but I think from what I can remember, my earliest introduction to your books, the Skyscrapers of the Midwest and Salamander Dreams.
Both of those are great books. I mean, Skyscrapers is what I consider one of the pillars of AdHouse. It's a great story. I'm so proud of what Josh created, and it's one of the books that I'll always try and keep in print. Unlike Salamander, which has gone out of print, but Hope has created I believe a Kindle version that you can order off some website and read digitally if someone is so inclined.
Wow! So I'm glad I have my hard copy of that. Yeah.
That was one of the fastest selling original graphic novels we ever created. And I think Warren Ellis, I think, had something to do with it because back then he had the message board /forum, and he just came out and promoted the book, and it sold really fast.
Huh. Well, now tell us a little bit about the history of AdHouse.
The history of AdHouse is, I think like a lot of people in comics, we started out as a fanboy. And then I grew up and I went to school for design, and on a lark when I was a senior in school, I sent my portfolio out to 3 comic book companies, and one of them took me up on working for them, and that was Eclipse Comics. So I did a stint at Eclipse for about a year. That was on the West Coast, and decided to move back to the East Coast. And when I did that, I, kept in contact with various people and started freelancing in the comic biz. I love book design, and while people do appreciate good book design, often they don't really want to pay you. So I said, eventually, why not do book design for myself and start a publishing company? And so that's how AdHouse Books came about, was through fandom, and then working a bit in the business and making some contacts, and then going to shows like the Small Press Expo and just meeting people.
Huh. Now, it seems like quite a big step going from something that is fan-related to a new publishing house. So, what were some of the challenges that you faced early on?
Well, pretty much any business-related item is a challenge because I didn't really go to school for that. It's all research and asking, friends and other business people, how they do things. Then after that, it's funny, but my go-to problem is in regards to publishing is warehousing. When you publish that first book, you just think everyone's going to buy one, and they don't. So you tend to publish or, print too many. And then after that, if you publish, 5 to 7 titles a year, and for me, I've been doing it 13 years, it really starts to add up. And so it just becomes a challenge in regards to how to economically warehouse everything you publish.
So does that continue to be one of the biggest challenges?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the economics pretty much sort themselves out. The talent is out there. While distribution is a challenge, we kind of have the system down, even though it's not a great system. So, yeah, it's mostly just, you're creating real things, and where do you put those real things, as opposed to, a digital comic where it lives in the ones and zeros.
Yeah. Now, have you considered doing something in digital?
We have, and we did. It was interesting. Comixology approached us, when they were just getting started. And back then, they didn't have Marvel and DC yet. So they would take our titles and actually go ahead and program them for us. And then when Marvel and DC came on board, they didn't have the manpower to take care of everyone. So they took care of the big fish. So then it became our, responsibility to program the work. And I'm small press. I don't have the, resources to do that. So I haven't checked lately, but a while back, if you looked, it was like maybe 5 or 6 titles that we, published, like 8 years ago, and then nothing. Nothing new. And so it became kind of frustrating. And so oddly enough, like 2 months ago, I contacted Comixology and said, listen, I want you to take down everything AdHouse related. I really don't want to do digital this way. If we do digital, I want to have a restart, a reboot. But for now, we've always been known for our production of our real books, our printed books, and so I think we'll just focus on that.
So right now, no solid plans for anything digital on your own, or at least non-Comixology anytime soon?
Right. Well, I've done the research, and if I have the time or, the resources, we will reboot, but it's still just in the planning stages right now. So nothing on the near future.
Okay. Now, you mentioned your background in design, and I introduced you as the publisher of AdHouse, but you wear multiple hats there. So what are all the tasks that you perform?
Under the publisher umbrella, it's, working with the creators to get the work created. So that's, talking to them about file formats, design, making the book as you know it. And then that's taking those files and information and talking to the printer, paying the printer. Actually, I have an invoice on my desk right now I need to ship out tomorrow. And then having the printer ship the books, and then once they arrive, sending them to the distributor and getting copies out to the stores, while at the same time letting all the readers or possible readers know that this stuff exists. So, and then as books start to sell, we go to shows, other events, signings, things like that. We're in the loop there. And eventually, hopefully, we're cutting checks to the creators so they're making money. And I think that's most of the cycle. I can't think of anything else.
Now, you mentioned a second ago Salamander Dream being, I guess, an unexpected seller at the time through Ellis's mention. What are some other titles that you have that have been, I don't know, I guess kind of a surprise to you, that have really caught on in ways that you didn't anticipate, or some kind of memorable publishing events?
One of the ones, coming from a design background, one of the ones I'm most proud of is Aphrodisiac. Jim Rugg is a phenomenal designer, creator, and artist. And just, sometimes you have a work that you feel really proud about and you want other people to know about it. And so we submitted it to the AIGA's 50/50 competition, which is the 50 best covers and the 50 best designed books of that year. And it actually won one of the 50 best books designed the year it came out. So that's one of the, proudest achievements in regards to AdHouse. So I can, have a sweet spot for Aphrodisiac in that regard, other than just being a phenomenal book.
Mm-hmm.
And what else can I tell you about? Do you have any you want me to talk about? Any books you're curious about?
Yeah, no. Well, you mentioned Aphrodisiac. In fact, not too long ago, we had Jim on the show for an interview, and we spent.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I remember him mentioning that. Yeah.
Yeah, we spent quite a bit of time talking about Aphrodisiac, and of course, along with Street Angel. And in fact, on this episode, we're going to be discussing what are you calling it now? The pink edition, the new edition of Street Angel.
That's probably the simplest one. Yes, the pink edition.
Yeah, so it's like something like almost like the Pink album. So it's the pink edition of Street Angel. So yeah, he was fun to have on, and it was great. And as much as I like Street Angel, I just really enjoyed Aphrodisiac because it was a very hilarious conceit, and just on top of the design.
It's one of those things. I love going to these shows and putting these books out there and having someone who knows nothing about AdHouse or nothing about Aphrodisiac walk up, pick it up, and they're just blown away by it, And with Aphrodisiac, with it kind of being a faux historical, collection of a character throughout all types of, comic existence, it's a neat thing. It's like, if you squint your eyes, this thing did exist. Aphrodisiac did exist,
I know. I mean, it does seem like, it's right there as a part of history. Now, you're going to be at Heroes Con in about a week and a half. So, in fact, we should say that when this episode goes up, it'll be 2 days before Heroes Con. So you're going to be there. What are you going to have at the table?
Not so much. I guess what we're going to have at the table is who we're going to be with. Mm-hmm. Jim Rugg will be to our left. It's always nice to, hang out with Jim. And then to our right, we'll have Stuart and Kathryn Immonen, whose new book, Russian Olive to Red King, will be there. And I believe a little bit to our left is Sophie Goldstein, whose new book, The Oven, I think dropped today, this Wednesday. And let's see, who else is going to be there? Gregory Benton will be there with B+F. And, when you do lists like this, I know I'm forgetting somebody.
That's okay. And most of what you're mentioning now we're discussing on this episode. So it'll be great because we're going to be at Heroes Con. It'll be great to meet these guys.
Oh, no, that's fantastic when you can, you get to read the work and then you get to meet the creator. And actually, I have a book on my nightstand that I'm trying to finish reading before Heroes Con so I can talk to the creator about it. So, yeah, no, that's always a great thing.
Now, of course, we're talking about it. We're familiar with, The Oven, Russian Olive to Red King, Pope Hats. What books do you have in the works right now? What can we expect in the fall and into next year?
At this point, the only fall release we have is called if you can mispronounce something, I will. So the way I pronounce this book, I pronounce it Gigant, which is, I guess, Danish for giant.
Okay.
But it's by Rune Ryberg, and again, I'm probably mispronouncing his name. I have not met Rune. He is Danish. He sent me this proposal, like maybe two and a half months ago. And it's one of these projects that I always like not challenges, but interesting takes on things. And it's the only project that I know of where he pitched me, I reviewed it, and we had a signed contract all within 24 hours.
Wow, that's quick.
So, yeah, it was quick. And it just, it speaks to how good I thought the work is. It's very, him being Danish, it's very European. It's kind of a metaphor story. The color's wonderful. The line quality is kind of sketchy and wonderful. And actually, the Copenhagen Comic Festival was just this past weekend, and he won an award for this book in Danish, and it's called the Ping Award. And I know nothing about it other than he put a picture of this like duck-like statue up on Tumblr and said he won. So I'm really happy for him. I think it bodes well for us with bringing it into the States and other English-speaking countries. And it's a nice little book. I've been taking the Danish. He sent me a Danish version, and I've been taking it around to shows so people can see it. So I'll have a copy at HeroesCon if you want to take a look.
Oh yeah, that'll be great. So he submitted something, and within 24 hours, you already had the contract. So do you get many submissions from creators that just contact you cold, or are they usually connections?
Yeah, it does happen. The other cold contact that happened to become a wonderful thing was Duncan the Wonder Dog. Adam Hines. Have you read Duncan yet?
No, I haven't.
It's the 400-page monstrosity of a book that we published volume 1 of supposedly 9 volumes. And it's not an easy reader. You have to give it thought and time and energy, but it's very rewarding. And it's just, the art is kind of Dave McKean-esque in that there's a lot of collage and, layers and things like that. But his drawing isn't. His drawing is, I want to say, almost Disney-esque, and it's simplicity and form. But anyway, the short pitch of the story is that it's a world where animals can talk and humans can understand them, and how the world changes because of that. This first volume is essentially just bringing all the history of this universe together via all these different tapestries. And spoiler warning, Duncan the Wonder Dog doesn't actually appear until like the last 6 pages of the book. So stuff like that just cracks me up. Anyway, that was a blind pitch, and both he and I found a lot of success with that. It won the LA Festival of the Book Award the year it was nominated. It won the very first Lind Ward Prize. Do you know that prize? It's given out by, I believe, maybe Penn State. And it's the only cash prize given to, works of comics.
Penn State.
And, yeah, and I think it's maybe in its 3rd or 4th year of existence. It's been nominated for other awards, and we've gone through maybe 3 or 4 printings just because it is such a book. It's 8.5 by 11. It's 400 pages. I get like 12 of them in a case.
Wow. So it's kind of a brick.
Again, this gets back to the warehousing thing, right?
Yeah. Now, will you have some of these titles, such as Duncan the Wonder Dog and others, there at the table at HeroesCon?
Yeah, we try and represent everything we publish at these shows, so we'll have a few copies there. Oh,
well, that'll be good. And I don't know yet, and I think I've seen, but I can't remember where your table is. So for the sake of my wallet, I hope I'm not that close to your table.
I know what you mean by that. HeroesCon can, lure you and have you open your wallet all at the same time.
Yeah, and then afterwards I have to contend with my wife, so I have to watch it.
Yeah, I completely. Well, the other thing too is, we talked about digital works. Duncan, I believe, can actually be read online for free still. Adam put it on his website, and I believe it's still up there somewhere. You just have to, search for it. So if you really want to read it, you can read it for free out there on the internets.
Okay. Chris, I want to thank you for taking the time and introducing me and our listeners to the history of AdHouse, and we have a fun time discussing your recent titles. So let's go ahead and get to that.
Okay. Thanks for your interest again, Derek.
Okay. Thanks. So there you go, Andy. I had a fun time talking with Chris, and Chris is going to be at HeroesCon this week.
Oh, yeah, that'll be fun.
Yeah, so I'll get to see him in person and talk with him there, because AdHouse has a lot of good books, and he was, even told me, as you could hear, about several upcoming projects. But let's talk about this year's AdHouse output up to this point.
Well, Derek, the first book we're going to take a look at is called Street Angel, story and art by Jim Rugg, and also story by Brian Maruca. Mm-hmm. And this is actually a book that originally came out in 2005. This is a somewhat expanded edition, a hardcover, very nice hardcover edition. It's a series of loosely connected short stories about a girl named Jessie Sanchez. And the book says that she is an orphan of the streets and skateboarding daughter of justice. In Wilkesboro, Angel City's worst ghetto, she fights ninjas, drugs, nepotism, and pre-algebra as Street Angel. I just love the pre-algebra, and there actually are a couple of math references in there, which really make it fun.
Now, you mentioned that this came out previously, but this is a new edition. And if you remember, several months ago, Kunka and I had Jim Rugg on the Comics Alternative, and so we interviewed him. This was a little while after the release of Street Angel, and he was telling us that he was just about to, or they had just at the time, published this new edition. And when I was talking with Chris, we were referring to it as the pink edition of Street Angel. So if you got an earlier edition of Street Angel, which I did when we spoke with Jim a while back, the art, the pages are white. Okay, mm-hmm. so it's in black and white. But then in this new edition, they use a pink tinted paper, and there are places where it looks a little purplish as well, but it's primarily pink. And we were talking with a Jim back, and you can listen to that interview. But we were asking him about this. He said that he had thought about a new edition, and for some reason the idea of paper color came to mind, and he wouldn't have thought that pink would have worked, but it did. And so that's why they decided to come out with this new edition of Street Angel with the pink pages.
Yeah, it really does work well. I can't really explain why it works well, but it does.
Yeah, and I know that, historically, traditionally, we think of pink being associated with girls, and I think that's part of the irony here, is that, Jessica Sanchez, the Street Angel, is definitely not your girly girl.
No. No, it's not. And the fun thing, and I think by and large this is just a fun book. It's about this girl named Jessie Sanchez, who's a 12-year-old, and just to give you kind of a sense of what the book is like, the very first story is called Dr. Pangea's Continental Conundrum, and it's about this mad scientist named Dr. Pangea who wants to bring all of the continents of the earth back together into one huge landmass. So as the book starts, Street Angel has been called in to visit the mayor and the police chief to stop Dr. Pangea, and it's a hilarious introduction. I'm not going to tell you what happens, but it's just so funny and so irreverent, and it gives you a really good feel for what's going to happen through the rest of the book. I mean, Street Angel takes no prisoners. She doesn't put up with any BS from anybody, whether it's the mayor, the chief of police, a whole gang of ninjas, or whatever. It's just crazy action and crazy fun. And I should also mention that Street Angel's sidekick is a guy named Bald Eagle. Now, Bald Eagle is not your typical character. He only has one limb. He has a left arm, and he doesn't have any other limbs, and he rides a skateboard. But you would think this guy couldn't get into a lot, right? Well, he gets into a lot.
Yeah. I feel that I don't know how much more I have to say about this book because I talked about it a lot when we spoke with Jim Rugg. But I'm curious, though. This was your first time reading it, Andy?
It is.
Okay, so of these various stories, and I mean, they are all ultimately connected because they're stories about Jessica or Street Angel, but they can easily stand on their own, each individual story, without the others. Of all of them, do you have a favorite?
You know, they were all a lot of fun. I really liked Aphrodisiac, which is about a once famous, actually, comic character named called Aphrodisiac, and he's kind of in his decline. Actually, Street Angel finds him. Jesse finds him at. I think he's like leaning up against a dumpster. He's not, certainly not. He's certainly seen better days, and a gang of rednecks comes up. And you think, this is not going to go well, but it's just absolutely crazy. But there's also an element of respect that she shows Aphrodisiac, and that they're kind of they have a lot in common, and that they're kind of doing the same thing. He's from one era, she's from another era. So that was a lot of fun. Also, A Ring Before Dying was a good story. Jesse and Bald Eagle get hit by an ambulance and end up in the hospital with a blind ninja girl. You can just imagine the places that these guys take these stories. They're just so whacked out, but there's something about the way Rugg and Maruka write that it just seems normal. You know, you don't feel like they're manipulating things. It's just the universe that they've created here. It just seems right for this character.
Yeah, exactly. And one of the things I love most about Jim Rugg's work is his sense of humor, and it's not, let's say, like an Evan Dorkin sense of humor, which is more out there, obvious, and in your face. And I love that. I mean, I think that, Dorkin's one of the funniest guys in comics today. But Rugg's sense of humor is a bit more subtle. And also it's much more enmeshed in pop culture, especially older pop culture. And so he makes a lot of these references. I mean, even in Street Angel itself. I mean, look, he's hitting on a lot of the sweet spots of comics readers. A lot of the action. There's ninjas in here. Street fighting. Then you have a character like Aphrodisiac, and that takes us back to, let's say, 1970s television and blaxploitation films. And in fact, I agree that one of my favorite stories. I agree with you in that one of the favorite stories was Aphrodisiac. That was one of my favorites as well. But if you haven't already read it, you should definitely read the book that came after the Street Angel stories, and that is Aphrodisiac. Are you familiar with that?
Just from reading this and doing a little poking around, but yeah, I definitely want to read that.
Yeah, that's another AdHouse book that came out a few years ago, and it, as you can tell by the title, it's all about the character Aphrodisiac. So we get to see him in his heyday, and like Street Angel, it's made up of individual stories that are all strung together by the fact that they're about the same character, and so you can look at both Aphrodisiac and also Street Angel as if this were a television show. It would be something like, let's say, Shaft or The Rockford Files. Each episode is an individual story, an individual case, if you will, that stands on its own. And so both of those books are structured in that way. I think that Aphrodisiac is much more hilarious because Rugg is playing off of a lot of 1970s, especially cultural icons in not only TV and film, but also in comics and toys as well. And in fact, there's one page we have this up in the show notes for our interview with Jim Rugg, and we published that on February 6th. And in the book Aphrodisiac, there's this one page that's set up like the old, the toy Big Jim. There used to be an ad for Big Jim's Pack, P-A-C-K. This is a one-pager, Aphrodisiac's Load, L-O-A-D. And instead of Big Jim's Pack, which are, all these guys, these action fighters, you have all of these very attractive women. And of course, part of the joke is, Aphrodisiac is a chick magnet as well. And he satisfies the ladies. But it's interesting in that Aphrodisiac got his start as a Street Angel story and then went on to have a life all of his own. And in fact, Chris Pitzer mentioned in our brief conversation mentioned that one of his surprises was the fact that the book Aphrodisiac really did take off.
Yeah, I'm really not that surprised because it's a very compelling story, and it's got its own backstory clearly intending to go somewhere in the Street Angel story. So yeah, I was not surprised at that at all. And Derek, this book really does have something for everybody. I mean, you've got a mad scientist story, you've got a robot story, you've got a shark story, you've got Satan and Jesus, you've got everything is in here. I mean, what else could you want?
Yeah, and it's I mentioned the humor in Rugg and Maruka's writing, but there's even a tender side to it. In fact, one of my favorite stories in the collection is Down in the Dumpster Blues, where Jessica finds a homeless guy because she herself is in a similar situation. She's homeless, and it's I don't know, just a different tone to when compared to the other stories in the collection.
Yeah, I think it was too. I mean, it's not all just action and mayhem. I mean, there's real character in here, and there's real character development, and yeah, there is a sweet side to it, and that really comes through.
Mm-hmm. Now, this book came out earlier this year. I believe the release date of Street Angel was, or at least this version, was back in February, if I'm not mistaken. The original Street Angel, the one that's in black and white, was released in August of 2014. And in fact, we are only looking at this year's releases from AdHouse, so starting in January up to this summer. But Street Angel, we wanted to start with that because it was previously published, but this pink edition came out just a few months ago in February.
Yeah, and if you look on the back of it, it's funny how they market it. They have YA, young adult, kung fu, superhero, comedy. Yeah. So it's just trying to grab everything.
Now it says young adult. Now, do you know if you have this book in your library?
I don't know if we have it in our library yet. I'm probably going to request it, and I would. There's considerable violence in here, but it's the type of violence that it's kind of tongue-in-cheek violence,
Okay, so because it's tempered with the comedy, you think? Because I was going to ask you if you thought it would be okay for young readers to pick up at the library.
Yeah, I think it would probably be okay. I think we've got things that are similar enough to this already over there that it would be okay. We'll see. We'll see if anybody complains.
Another release from AdHouse, and this came out in January of this year, is Eric Haven's And that's how I guess you pronounce the title. It's U-R.
I guess so.
Of course, you could pronounce it U-R, but I've been calling it
Mm-hmm.
Now, how do we start with this? How would you describe
Insane, crazy, absurd, fun, all of those things and more. Yeah. This is this is a much shorter book than Street Angel. This is, I don't have a page numbers here, but I would say, it's definitely less than 100 pages. It's a collection of short tales, and I would say they're mostly unrelated, although we do have a lot of recurring stories about a character named Race Murdoch, which we'll have more to say about in just a moment. Mm-hmm. But these are pretty much short stories. They're kind of adventure, science fiction, fantasy, horror type stories. They usually involve someone or something getting mutilated. There's a lot of mutilation going on here. But again, it's done with humor. It's done with a humorous touch. And so it's not it's not something that is probably going to keep you up at night. Maybe it will. I don't know.
It is kind of freaky. Now, I was not familiar with Eric Haven before reading but his forte is not so much in comics as it is other media.
Right. I actually did a little research on Haven, and he is the producer and sometimes associate producer of the TV show Mythbusters.
So, wow. Now, I've watched Mythbusters. I know that my wife and my kids are much bigger fans of Mythbusters than I am, but what I've seen I really like. I think that's a really well-done show. Mm-hmm. Do you watch it?
No, I don't.
Oh, it's really good stuff. I mean, a lot of the reality-type TV I'm not into, but Mythbusters is definitely worth watching, I think. And Mythbusters can be funny, but it's just nowhere near the same kind of humor as we find in Now, of these various stories, some longer, some shorter in the book, do you have any favorites?
One of the short ones that I really, really liked is called Bedman, Dream Lord of the Night Sky. And it's kind of an adult version of Little Nemo in Slumberland. Yeah. It's about a guy who's in his bed, and he goes patrolling the universe, flying on his bed. And it has that similarity, like I said, to Little Nemo and Slumberland, but that's really the only thing that is like that, except that he sees a lot of freaky things, and he's kind of a superhero of the bedtime travel, if you want to call it that. It's just crazy. I mean, it makes no sense, but it's so much fun. It even looks like, Derek, I think one of those. It doesn't really look like Little Nemo and Slumberland, but it looks like some of those older science fiction comics of like maybe the 40s, early 50s. It's got kind of that style to it.
Exactly, and the way that this starts. In fact, his uniform, he's dressed in pajamas, and over his right breast pocket is the letter B for Batman. Yeah. He wears a mask, but on his head is it looks like one of those old-fashioned sleep caps on his head. And it begins, firmly tucked in, Bedman goes on patrol, and he's in a bed, laying down, and he's flying. So the bed's flying, and he says, all looks quiet. But then suddenly, as a meteor passes him. Wow, a meteor. It's headed straight for downtown. Bedman chases after the hissing, streaking space rock. He says, I've got to stop this thing, and overtakes it. And so then he spins his bed around, and Bedman swings his mighty hoverbed directly into the path of the oncoming meteor. The scorching mass is utterly destroyed. And so he blows it up. And he does all this while he's just laying in bed. And that's all he does.
Yeah.
And then
I was going to say his bed is actually a weapon, too, because he actually does fire into the meteor.
Yeah. And he goes on a couple of other adventures. And then at one point, we see him lying in bed, and he wakes up. And then he goes about his daily life. And then he goes back to bed at the end of the day, goes to sleep. And then we have another adventure of Bedman. And you're right, it's very much like Little Nemo.
Yeah, it's just crazy fun. I mean, I can just see if this book were bigger, I would just I wish it were bigger. I wish there were more to it. But what's here is great. I could read stuff like this all day.
Yeah, see, this reminds me of the kind of humor we've been seeing over the past year or two from creators like Derek Van Giesen with Eel Mansions, and I think Ryan Brown, especially with God Hates Astronauts. It's this kind of offbeat, obscure, absurd kind of humor. It doesn't seem to make much sense, but if you look at it indirectly, like if you turn your head and don't look at it, at the humor, straight in the face, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Like, for instance, one story that's just really whacked out is called The Equestrian. And the only thing this comic is this, it's not a ghost, but it looks like an emaciated, ghostly figure, a female, I assume, who's an equestrian, riding a horse. And as she's riding, I mean, the entire comic is her riding and wreaking havoc. So she throws her, a riding crop at a lighthouse. And then, of course, the light goes out, and then we see a ship crashing. And then she throws the riding crop at a plane, and it pierces the wing, and the plane crashes, and then she uses her riding crop to hit the Earth a couple of times, and then the Earth cracks. And that's it. That's the story.
And that's it. Yeah,
that's the
end of it.
equestrian.
Yeah, these are just so whacked out. I also like the it's one called Even an Android Can Dance. and it reminds me of my wife, because she says I'm a terrible dancer, and I am, and she does not let me dance in public. But it starts out with this woman grabbing this guy by the arm, and he says, "Please, I can't. I hate dancing. I hate it." And she says, "Come on, it'll be fun." And he says, "I shouldn't be here. I should go home." And she says, "Relax, will you?" And he says, "You don't understand. When I dance, terrible things happen." And she's dancing already, and she says, "Like what?" And he starts dancing, and then he says, "Oh, no, no." And then all these catastrophic things throughout not just the world, but the universe come to pass. I mean, it's kind of the butterfly effect gone gonzo.
Yeah, that was a good one. A story that's a little longer. I think it's the third piece, Reptilica. Mm-hmm. It starts off with this guy who looks a lot like Race Murdoch. I don't know if it's the same person, but it looks like someone we're going to discuss in a few minutes, I'm sure, Race Murdoch. And he's walking down the street. And the thing I like best about this comic is that second panel, because this guy's walking down the street, and he says, "Liver, tingling." And then we see in a speech bubble a liver with energy lines coming from it. From where his liver is, and he goes, "There must be a bar nearby."
Right, it's like it's his spider sense.
Yeah, so his liver sense is tingling, and he finds a bar, and then that's the beginning of whatever weird adventure happens there. And it is weird.
It is weird. Yeah,
just like the first story as well. It's very similar to the Equestrian, right? It just doesn't make any sense if you look at it head on. This one's called Man Cat. Mm-hmm. And it is a man who's a cat, or at least a cat who looks like a man. And a cat goes into this house, does what a cat does, goes into a refrigerator, drinks milk, but then makes a mess and leaves the milk on the floor, slashes at curtains, pees on the carpet, goes into a drawer, takes things out, and ends up blowing off its own head. And then it gets even weirder than that. A winged head comes out of the dead cat.
Yeah, it's so weird. It's so bizarre.
But I would have to say that the most bizarre / enjoyable stories in would have to be the Race Murdoch comics.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, these are, I think these hold a special place for me as well.
Yeah. And the first several strips have, I think, a little more cohesion than the other ones, because Race Murdoch, it's almost like we have different installments. So in this first strip, this is his origin story. It says, Race Murdoch's birth was quite startling. And so we see his mother on the table, and the doctor's looking between her legs. He goes, "Oh, God." And then we see the image of Race coming out of the womb, and it's just this face. And it's sweating and grimacy, and the caption reads, "He crowned face first, eyes open, and a full set of gnashing adult teeth." Despite this audacious entrance, Race Murdoch's existence was consistently unremarkable. And then next we see him, I guess he's looking out of a window. It could be him looking in a mirror, but I guess out of a window. It says, now 42 years old, he wonders where his life has gone and how much time he has left. And he thinks, my God. And then you get, next, Race Murdoch takes a wife. And then the second story is about the wife. And then in the wife story, the caption at the final panel says, next, a new robot head. And the new story is about him getting a new robot head. And then the one after the robot head story, the final panel has, next, penis cancer. And Race gets penis cancer along with the robot head. And so that's how the first several stories or the strips begin, and they're connected. After that, it gets a little looser, but it still concerns the character Race Murdoch.
Yeah, and they just get wackier and wackier. But, I mean, you're laughing at all of them. And in a lot of them, Race either gets, his head explodes or something awful happens to him. But, he keeps coming back for the next comic.
Yeah. I mean, you just turn to any of these strips, and any one you find is going to be hilarious. I just turned to one. At a small dig in the Oakland Hills, amateur archaeologist Race Murdoch unearths a bizarre object. A carved horn made of bone, alabaster white, so white it glowed. The horn served no musical purpose, and then in the final panel, there's this weird, freaky creature right outside of Earth's orbit. It says, "It was a beacon, a summons for the old ones."
Yeah.
And that's it. And that's all about that story. You don't. There's no follow up.
Yeah, yeah. And you know, Derek, this kind of reminds me of Dakota McFadzean's "Don't Get Eaten by Anything."
Oh, that's good. I hadn't thought of that. But you're right.
We discussed when we did the conundrum spotlight. A lot of similarities, but Eric Haven uses a broader, he uses a bigger platform than, McFadzean's using like a 4-panel strip. But I think they do a lot of the same things. There's a lot of that absurdist humor and a lot of that, like I said, absurdist. It's kind of doom and gloom, but it's funny too.
Yeah.
So yeah, this is a hilarious book. I mean, it really is. I mean, you can turn to any part of it and just have a great time.
Another one. Race Murdoch always kept a stack of New Yorkers near the toilet, and it shows him on the toilet reading. The magazine's dry, urbane wit helped to pass the time. Subsequently, Race Murdoch began to associate the New Yorker with the need to defecate, which I find hilarious. And then it shows him at a museum, and he looks at an image of, the classic New Yorker, the guy with the top hat and the monocle. Mm-hmm. Nowhere was the effect more pronounced than at the Eustace Tilley exhibit. And it shows him looking at that painting, and crap is shooting out of his ass, and he says, "Good Lord!" It's just... Again, it's juvenile humor that is absurd and nonsensical, which is definitely right up my alley.
Yeah, and he has also a lot of fun with other types of comics. Like he's got this thing where he has fun with some of the Marvel Comics slogans from the past.
Oh yeah,
there's one that says Race Murdoch suffered from a rare form of Tourette's syndrome, and he just screams, "It's clobbering time!" And then it goes to the next panel. Whenever he was frustrated or overexcited, he would shout out superhero battle calls, and there's nobody else standing around, and he yells, "Avengers, assemble!" At times, the resultant effect was mildly amusing, and he's got these 2 pieces of toast coming out of his toaster that are just burned.
Those are Pop-Tarts.
Are they Pop-Tarts?
Yeah.
They are Pop-Tarts. And he says, "Flame on!" And then it says, but mostly it was just awkward. And there's a scene of him having sex, and it says, "Imperious Rex."
He screams that out, yeah.
He screams it out. It's just crazy stuff.
Yeah. And if this is the kind of comics that Eric Haven writes, I hope he spends less time on Mythbusters and more times producing more comics. This has to be one of the funniest of the year so far that I've read.
Oh yeah. Yeah, and my only complaint is it's too short. I wanted more.
Yeah. And I didn't check out. I didn't, I guess, do a web search. I'm wondering if these individual stories were collected elsewhere. It doesn't indicate as such in the book. I was looking at the copyright page because many times it'll say that, most of the stories appeared in these anthologies or these collections, but it doesn't say.
Yeah, and it's a really nice book too, and it actually has a dust jacket.
Yeah, especially for being a paperback and such a short book, I was impressed that it has its own dust jacket.
Yeah, and you get some really cool, weird art inside the dust jacket as well.
Mm-hmm. So if you love humorous comics, especially offbeat, absurdist stuff like you'll find from the likes of Dakota McFadzean, Ryan Brown, and Derek Van Giesen, and even Tom Neely, I think. He reminds me of some of the humor of Tom Neely.
Yeah.
Then definitely check out Eric Haven's Ur. So, Andy, let's move on to the next AdHouse book. This one came out just this month, the first part of June, and this is issue number 4 of Ethan Rilly's Pope Hats.
Yes, and Derek, this is one of those books. I started reading this book late at night. I was really tired, and I went through it. And it is a collection of short stories, graphic novels. And I was really, really tired reading it, and I got through the end of it, and I thought, boy, this is not connecting with me at all. And then the next day I read through it again, and it was like a completely different experience. It was, these stories really resonated with me. So I don't know if that means that, all readers, I'm sure, won't have the same experience I did, but, it may resonate with you right off the bat. But it did remind me a lot of 2 books that we looked at fairly recently, and that is Seth's Palookaville and Adrian Tamine's Optic Nerve number 14.
Yeah, you're spot on in both of those comparisons. I was thinking the exact same thing. And in fact, I put Rilly's work, I guess, what we see in Pope Hats number 4, but even more so the previous issues of Pope Hats, I would put those unambiguously in the same camp of comics produced by people like Seth and Adrian Tamine. Now, I'm curious about your reading experience. You mentioned that the first time around you wondered, what's the big deal? I didn't see much of it here. It didn't resonate with you. And then the second time, it did. Do you think it was that second time the fact that you were a little more rested, or that it takes a little more digestion time, so to speak, to get to Rilly's work?
I think probably both of those things. I was more rested, and I was probably a lot more focused than I was the first time I read it through. But I started to see things that I didn't see the first time. And I remember the first time when I would get to the end of the story, and I would think, wow, the payoff really doesn't pay off. But I think there's a lot more going on here than just that. I think Ethan really wants us to do some thought, and he's not going to do everything for the reader. He wants the reader to put some effort into it. And I'm not saying that Adrian Tamine and Seth lay everything out so that you don't have to do any thinking. That's not the case. But I think there's something about Ethan Rilly's work that makes you, I hate to say work a little harder, but maybe makes you reflect a little bit more about how it might connect to you personally.
Yeah, and on top of that, I would say that he does require, and I don't think there's anything wrong with the way you put it, that he requires more effort on the part of the reader. And I think this is where he shares some similarities with the aforementioned Tamine and Seth, in that in many of Rilly's stories, the shorter works that we have here in Pope Hats number 4, and then in the previous Pope Hat issues, which I want to talk about in a second, is there are times when we're following characters around, and there is, sometimes a scenic change, I guess traditionally, happens on the page turn. Mm-hmm. In that we get characters or a character who goes from one moment in their life to another, or from one event in their life to the next, when you turn the page. And so there is that almost natural sense of movement, of sequentiality. But I think with Rilly's work, sometimes we're shifted in terms of event, actions, and even, temporal rifts within the middle of a page, sometimes in a particular strip on a page, and that's fine. I mean, to me, that's natural in its own way. But when you're reading Rilly for the first time, it may take a little getting used to. And so that's where I think the extra effort on the part of the reader needs to come in. You need to understand that he's writing stories in a very different way than, let's say, for lack of a better term, your traditional comic book, which for the most part, I would argue, doesn't really make difficult or ambiguous sequential action and causal linkage. I think with Rilly, sometimes you have to go back and reread, or really pay attention closely the first time you read, to make sure that you get that these are actions and characters and events that are connected from one to the other. Now, I ask you about your experience reading it first and then reading it a second time, because my experience reading Pope Hats number 4 It's different from yours. I mean, I did the first time around think, this is different, but for different reasons. Now, I had issues 1 through 3 of Pope Hats, and issues 1 through 3 of Pope Hats are very different from issue number 4. You mentioned that this is a collection of short stories, and if you look at the cover of Pope Hats number 4, it says on the lower right corner in this little triangle, in this issue, and you have a name of the stories, the Hollow, the Nest, New Friend, Bitter Drummer, Stained Glass, and more. Those are the titles of the stories. But it says short stories in big letters, so we know that this is a collection of short stories. But his previous issues of Pope Hats, issue number 1 came out in the fall of 2009, 2 came out September of 2011, and then September of 2012 was issue number 3. So basically, an issue of Pope Hats will come out about every year, year and a half, maybe 2 years, depending. But those issues, 1 through 3, are very different. For the most part, not completely, but for the most part, the content of issues 1 through 3 of Pope Hats will have the story of Francis and Vicky. And Francis and Vicky are 2 roommates, or at least at the end of issue number 3, they are parting as roommates. But they're roommates. Francis works as, not a legal assistant, someone who works in a legal office. She's a clerk, I guess. She writes up briefs, and she's very good at what she does. Whereas her friend and roommate Vicky is the complete opposite, where Frances is a little more predictable and stable and down to earth. Vicky is an artist figure who is very difficult to predict what she will do, and she can be erratic in her behavior. She's an actress. She's an artist figure, and she's all over the place. And so Frances and Vicky are like 2 opposites. It's like the Odd Couple, really. Now, I mention this because Pope Hats number 4, we really don't get anything at all of Frances and Vicky, with the exception of a 1-page illustration. This is toward the back. This is after the letter section, Here and Now. You see these 2 girls. It looks like they're doing karaoke. The one who is not standing on the couch, that's Frances, and then the one who is standing on the couch being dramatic is Vicky. But that's the only Vicky and Frances bit that we have in this collection. Now, Rilly writes on the copyright page, and this is the inside front cover, at the bottom, if you'll notice, it says, "The Frances and Vicky story will resume in the next issue. Sorry for the long wait." So Ethan really is aware of the fact that his readers, his audience, they're into the Frances and Vicky storyline. I am. And he wanted to kind of, temper any expectations that are dashed, saying, well, I'm going to pick it up next time. I haven't left Vicky and Frances, but for now I want to give, in the next issue of Pope Hats, short stories. And these are stories that I think for the most part had been collected elsewhere.
Okay, well, that's good to know. And actually, I would like to go back, even though I saw those characters for a first-timer like me. They're not named on that page that you referred to next to the letters page. So I had no idea. I thought, what is this in reference to? But that clears that up. But I would definitely like to go back and read those first 3 issues just based on this, even though it sounds like they're different issues.
Oh, yeah. In fact, it's those previous issues of Pope Hats 1 through 3 that definitely reminds me of the work of Seth, Adrian Tomine, Chester Brown, and the like. Very much that kind of comic art, and which to me is like the pinnacle. When as you've heard us say, not just me, but I think you as well, over the past several episodes when we've talked about the work of Seth and then Adrian Tomine, that these are the tops in the field right now. I will always read anything that Seth does. I will always read anything that Adrian Tomine comes out with. And Ethan Rilly's the same. I think it's the same way. I want to see more from him. I think that the Frances and Vicky storyline, at least I hope, ultimately, on down the road, will be collected into its own book. But I wonder what all he has in store for future installments of the Frances and Vicky story. So I hope we don't have to wait that long for Pope Hats number 5. Now let's talk a little bit about the content of Pope Hats number 4, which we haven't really gotten to yet outside of mentioning the titles of the stories. There's several different ones. I think that there are, 7 stories in all. One of them, The Nest, is in 5 parts. And then there's a series of strips at the very back. This is the very last page before you get to the back cover. Of these 7 stories, are there any that really stood out to you as the cream of the crop?
Well, I think the large collection of stories called The Nest is a very, very good series of short stories. I think it's, five connected stories?
Right, five parts.
But, the first one I want to mention is actually a story called Stained Glass. And this was really, I really had a strong reaction to it. This story is about a man named Paulo who is commissioned to make a stained glass window, a series of stained glass windows for a church. And even from the very beginning, Paulo looks kind of out of place. He's drawn like he belongs, like maybe in a newspaper strip, like a comedic newspaper strip.
Little Henry.
Exactly like Little Henry in a lot of ways. But none of the other characters quite look like that. So
and he also reminds me of a Dan Klaus figure, too.
Oh, okay.
The way he looks.
Well, early on in the story, much is spoken about the church's history and the future, and we get the feeling that Paulo's work is going to be part of that future. And although the sponsor praises the work, Paulo realizes it has flaws in it, and there are certain things about it that he can't live with. And I'm not going to tell you what happens in the story from that point on, but it really has a lot to say about artistic views and artistic motivation. And is he creating these stained glass windows for the church, for himself, to satisfy his own artistic standard? And it's a little bit unsettling too when we get to the end of it and we realize what he has done and what he intends to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. This was, as with you, I guess, one of my favorites in the collection. Because it does deal with really, I guess you could say, really heavy issues. You mentioned Paulo being an artist figure, and he does what he does, and again, we won't give that away, because of his art. And in fact, when he does realize that the stained glass work that he does for this church, he sees it as flawed, it throws him into not only some despair and moments of questioning his abilities, but also gives him migraines. And so there's only one way, he thinks, out of that. And that's what happens toward the end of this story.
Mm-hmm. It's a very powerful story. And, I think, Derek, one of the things that strikes me about this story and all of the stories is I think each one of them has an event that occurs to the character. And we don't see the immediate effect of that event on the character, but we eventually do see it either working out through that character's thoughts, or it's something that we can reflect on at the very end. And this one does some of that. But to me, I think that's one of the strengths of the book is we don't have, a big event and then this character's immediate reaction to it. It takes time. Things have to settle into the character. They have to think about them. They have to dwell on them. And then something happens, or we get the hint that something's going to happen.
Yeah, and these are not grand events or life-changing, life-shattering moments like you'll see in a lot of, let's say, action-based comics, right? Mm-hmm. But these are things that you wouldn't think are necessarily out of the ordinary, but within an individual's ordinary life, they take on, at times, such as the case with Paulo in the stained glass story, this almost catastrophic level of significance, and can really move them to do certain things. Now, in light of that, what you just said, and I think that you put your finger on one way of looking at about all of the stories in this issue of Pope Hats. The story that comes after this, which is New Friend, stands, for me at least, in stark contrast to Stained Glass, in that it's a 2-pager, and each page is laid out in a 9-panel grid. This is more of a vignette of the narrator, which is this young guy going to see a friend who lives in another town, going to see him and stay with him briefly, and then goes home. And that's it. I mean, that's basically all that happens. And unlike stained glass, it's hard to discern something that moves the protagonist to a particular realization or action that takes place toward the last part of the story. This is just a guy going to visit his friend. His friend lives with someone who is a new friend, who is a woman, thus the title, New Friend. And they go one night to the night that he stays over to this party. He sleeps over and then goes home the next day. And that's basically it. There's not really much that goes on, but it's this kind of everydayness, this mundacity that really writes about, that I think makes this such a compelling story. Because someone could look at this and say, well, there's not much of a story there, but I would say, well, even the everyday things that we do contain narrative, and, we may take something, grandiose and momentous from that. Sometimes we can't take much of it, but it's nonetheless part of our life story.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right. People can look at this story and, read it on the surface and they can say, nothing really happens, but a lot does happen. And a lot of this involves, and this is something that we all bring something to this story regardless of our age, once we get past a certain age. I mean, we've all had friends that we haven't seen in a long time and we go back and see them again. And we realize normally two things: either they have changed or we have changed, or both. And in this story, the narrator visits with Brian, as you mentioned, and Brian, he even mentions like the past when he knew Brian. He said, Brian always seemed a little bit different from everyone else. He looked out of place. And that's a very, very important thing. And I think in a lot of these stories, you have certain words or phrases that are what you have to hang on to. They're kind of clues as to what's really going on. And he's talking to Brian about old times, and at the end of it, when the narrator is in this traffic jam, he has a realization, and it's not like a light bulb's going off and suddenly you get the story. But if you start thinking about it, you start thinking about where he is, what he's done. There's some pretty incredible things going on.
Mm-hmm. Now, Ethan Rilly has been nominated several times for the Doug Wright Award, which is an award for the Canadian Cartooning Association, and it's a really big deal. So this is someone that I don't know if he gets much traction in the United States. I'm aware of him. Did you know about Rilly before reading this issue of Pope Hats?
No, I didn't.
And I think that, we've compared him a number of times to people like Seth and Immonen. Those guys have, I think, more name recognition in at least the United States comics readership. Whether, comics readers read them or not, it's another matter. But it's somewhere along the line they're going to encounter names like Seth or Optic Nerve. They'll be recognizable. I think Pope Hats and Ethan Rilly may not come up as much or be as recognizable, but in my book, Rilly is someone who should be as recognized as those other guys.
I think so too. And again, for the right reader at the right time, and I think the first time I read it, I was not at the right time. That there are some very, very powerful things going on here. Much of these stories seem to be dealing with the passage of time and how it affects us and how it changes us and how we accept it or deny it as well.
Well, I think one of the stories that does this is one that we've mentioned, but we haven't gone into detail about, and this is the 5-part story, The Nest. Mm-hmm. And this is probably his most detailed narrative in the collection. We mentioned that it's in 5 parts, and so that makes it a little more detailed than some of the other stories. And some parts are 2-page long, some are 3 or more. But this is a story of this young woman who, I guess she's off at school. She comes back to live at home, and something has changed about her. She's not the same as she was before she went off to school, and the parents realize this. They take her to a psychologist or a psychiatrist, and we find out from the daughter that she feels that something's not right, and she even wonders if the people that she's come home to are actually not her parents. Mm-hmm. And she becomes a little paranoid, but she goes along with things. And it's about her trying to make her way back home, but I think even more so about the parents, especially the father, trying to find help for the daughter through various means. And the story, I guess the very end of part 5, ends, and it ends on kind of a jagged note. In other words, there's no neat tie-up, which I'm not sure how to interpret this, because given the kind of writing that Rilly does, and we've been mentioning this, little slices of life, it wouldn't surprise me if he chose to end this story, The Nest, that way, kind of abruptly, and let us wonder, what might happen later. Or another way of approaching this is that he has more in mind. There are more installments of The Nest, and he just hasn't gotten to them yet.
It could be that. And Derek, I want to ask you if I'm reading this wrong, but what happens at the end of that story, The Nest, is that the same character in the next story, Bitter Drummer?
I wondered the same thing, because visually they look similar. And we should point out that in the following story, the story that follows the 5th installment of The Nest is called Bitter Drummer. And this is about someone who, he's middle-aged, he has a family, he used to be a part of a band, and he briefly gets back together with members of his band. And this guy, the narrator, is a drummer, thus the title of the story, Bitter Drummer. He visually looks like the man that the father is talking to in a bar. I don't know if it's the same person. It could be, but other than the visuals, there seems no linkage between The Nest and Bitter Drummer.
Well, I think there's a little bit more, because in The Nest, this man that he meets in the bar talks about his twin sons. And in Bitter Drummer, there are 2 little boys that I don't think they're ever stated as twins, but they look an awful lot like twins.
You're right. Okay, so and he does mention that he's divorced from his wife, and he no longer has. Well, actually, he does have the kids now, because he had a problem with the wife having the kids. But in Bitter Drummer, he is married. We see him with his wife and the kids. But this could be an earlier part of his life, so who knows?
Yeah, and if it is, it really does give it another level of complexity and interest too. Because, like you said, The Nest ends on a fairly odd place. But again, maybe there's going to be more story, or maybe we're just supposed to reflect on the way that it ends here. Either way, I'm fine with either way.
Yeah. Maybe this is Ethan Rilly's Yoknapatawpha County, where you have characters who appear in one story as protagonists and then another story as background characters. Or, since we're talking about comics, maybe this is Rilly's Palomar.
Oh, yeah, definitely could be. And either one of those would be perfectly acceptable. Mm-hmm.
So I really liked Popats, and I hope that in issue number 5 it comes out sooner rather than later, and we get back to Francis and Vicky.
Yeah, and I'm interested in going back and discovering the first issues with Francis and Vicky.
Yeah, definitely check those out. Okay, let's move on to the next book from AdHouse, and this also comes out, or has come out, in June this month. This is The Oven by Sophie Goldstein. Now, Andy, how would you, and this is kind of a short book, a short graphic novel, how would you describe The Oven?
It is a short graphic novel, and it's a kind of a small, maybe not as small as a mini comic, but a smaller graphic novel. On the back, it lists it as science fiction / life, which I want to talk about that in just a moment.
Okay.
The story is about a young couple named Sid is the wife or the woman, and Eric is the guy. they've been together for about 3 years, and they want to move to a place where they are free from, it's never really stated, but the things that are typical in our day. They want to get away from cities. They want to get away from foods that are processed. All the things that a lot of people today are concerned about, and with good reason. So they take a trip on it looks like a rocket ship, and they go to this remote planet where there are very few resources, but everything that they have there is clean. It's natural, it's organic. The only problem is the sun is very, very hot, and you can't stay outside very long because exposure will burn you. So, and it's about how they are living their lives in this more natural environment and dealing with the dangers that are there and the other people that are there.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned going to another planet. I thought that this all took place on the same planet. It's just when we see them leaving their earlier home, this is a domed civilization. Mm-hmm. And
you're right. It could definitely be the same planet. Because
we see, in fact, the very first panel on the first page, when they're leaving this big dome, leaving the city in a ship, this world also has the two suns, mm-hmm. as we see throughout.
Yeah. I stand corrected. I think you're correct.
Yeah. And, the way that you've described it, it could easily be seen as, kind of an allegory of what you could describe as our contemporary society, a lot of people wanting to get off the grid because this community, which they call the oven, people want to live outside of surveillance. They don't want to live by, the government's or society's rules. They can do their own thing. They don't have to get approval to have kids, right? Mm-hmm. Because we learn early on that Eric, I don't know if they say why, but no, because he had acne. He couldn't reproduce. Sid, the girlfriend, could, but Eric couldn't because I guess he had a bad case of acne, which tells us something about this society, this government, and it's what happens when these guys actually do go out to live free. Now, Sid definitely lives this life, and I mean she not only adopts this philosophy, this way of living her life, but she becomes a part of it because she does, and I don't think this is a spoiler. She does become pregnant. It's Eric's baby. Eric, though, he doesn't really cozy up to the oven.
No, he doesn't.
No. And so it's about their relationship. But I think even more than about the relationship, I'm wondering if this is more Eric's story than, let's say, Sid or even Sid and Eric's story.
Mm-hmm. I think you could say that because, without giving too much away, it's Eric that comes to several realizations throughout the course of the story. Eric is the one whose character is changed. Sid, not really so much.
Exactly. However, if I were going to take a counter argument to that position, I would say, well, look at the cover, and what is the image on the cover? This is Sid. Mm-hmm. And how does the book end? The book ends with Sid by herself, dressed in ways very similar to as we see her on the cover, wrapped up because of the sun and the intensity of the radiation. And she is pregnant, and she is looking out over the horizon. So maybe this is indeed Sid's story.
Yeah, could be.
That given, I guess despite what Eric does and what she is left with, that she is the one who will endure. Mm-hmm. Because she does strike me as someone who is much more, level-headed, practical. She's someone who could endure, much more so than Eric, I think.
Yeah, and we see Eric clearly uncomfortable in this situation after not very much time. There's a really interesting scene where Eric is trying to he's doing some farm work. He's doing farming, and there's one of the characters named Tractor, who is a really, really interesting character. And Eric is trying to do some farming, and he said, I just want to finish already. Oh, I'm sorry, it's Bear. There's another character named Bear. It's not Tractor. And Bear says, there's no finishing, Eric. You just move on to the next task. And Eric is pretty much in disbelief. He's like, that's BS. And Bear says, no, that's farming. So Eric really doesn't have a clue as to what's going to be involved with this. And it's really interesting because, to me, on a personal level, because my wife and I have been talking a lot about more simple living, and we joke a lot about, she would be very happy living on a farm, and I'm like, I do not want to live on a farm. So we kind of have this humorous conversation, this humorous disagreement about this. But I know this is a very big topic. People living simpler, people living, downsizing, trying to do to eat better, eat more naturally, and things like this. So this is a topic that is very timely, and I think it's a really important topic.
Yeah. Now, had you heard of Sophie Goldstein before The Oven?
I think I had heard of her name before, but I could not have. Oh, is it? Oh no, what did she do before? Because it seems like there's something that she's done before that I'd heard of.
Well, at the very back where they have the author bio, it says that her work has previously been published in the Best American Comics 2013, the Pitchfork Review, Maple Key Comics, Sleep of Reason, Symbolia, Trip 8, and Irene 3. Now, if you had just asked me cold, have you read any Sophie Goldstein, I would have said no. But then after I read the author bio, I thought, okay, 2 of those I am familiar with. And I went back through and I looked. In fact, I have it sitting in my lap right now. Best American Comics 2013. She did a story called The Good Wife, and that's one that Kunka and I talked about a couple of years ago. This is in the volume that Jeff Smith edited, the 2013 volume of Best American Comics. And this was a story that, especially visually, really stood out to me. She's using a completely different kind of color scheme in this comic. These are very bright, basic, almost primal colors at times, which is very different from the art that we see in The Oven. And we haven't mentioned this, but it's not monotone or monochromatic, The Oven, but it has primarily an orange tint to it, most of the panels. And I think this goes hand in hand, at least for me, with the fact that they're at a place called The Oven and the intensity of the sun. These suns are represented, the stars are represented as, as orange. And so there's something about the color orange that means intensity. So it's the literal intensity of the heat and the terrain that they're living in out in The Oven, but it's also the intensity of the emotions and the affairs that both Sid and Eric go through individually as well as together.
Yeah.
So, but anyway, it's in Best American Comics, she does the story The Good Wife, and then in issue number 3 of Irene, and earlier we mentioned Dakota McFadzean when we were talking about Here, Dakota comes up again. He is one of the editors of this really good anthology, one of the last really great anthologies of comics that's still being produced today, and this is Irene. And in issue number 3 of Irene, Goldstein does a story called Edna 2. And it's actually one of the longer stories in this issue of Irene. So that is, I had to fish out my issue number 3 of Irene, and it's another one that's definitely worth looking at. So even though I didn't think that I was familiar with Goldstein's comics in the past, I was.
And I just saw, too, that, and I know now where I've seen her name, is she won an Ignatz Award in 2014 for her mini-comic House of Women Part 1, and I remember seeing her name on the ballot, so I think that's probably where that struck my memory.
So, I think one of the things about The Oven, it's one of those stories that could go on for much longer, and I think Goldstein could have developed this into more of a novel-length work, but I would call this more of a graphic novella. I mean, well, first and foremost, as listeners know, I'm not a big fan of the term graphic novel as a designation of, the medium. I think it's not accurate. I think it at times is very misleading. But this is more of a shorter form story, more like a novella than a novel, and it is longer than a short story.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I would call it a novella.
Yeah.
So it's just a quick in and out of what goes on with Sid and Eric trying to live off the grid.
Yep.
So anything else about the oven?
No, that's probably about it for me.
Okay, let's move on to the last book that we're going to be discussing on this AdHouse show, and this is the one that is not out yet. This comes out next month, July, but it's one that, and we're reading review copies of it in PDF form. This is Russian Olive to Red King. This is by Kathryn and Stuart Immonen. And although I know of the work of the Immonens, I haven't read them because I know that they do Marvel work, and I usually don't keep up with the superhero stuff, especially when it comes to Marvel. I like it. It's just, I don't get to it as often as I'd like. But now you are familiar with their previous book, Moving Pictures, right?
I did read Moving Pictures a couple of years ago. I'm not sure exactly when it came out, but I enjoyed it. It was a black and white graphic novel. You might call it a novella as well, not a very, very long book. But it dealt with the curators of a museum trying to basically hide all the works of art before the Nazis could get to them. Wow. And it's a very, very effective story. Some really wonderful characters. The art style in that was very different than the art style in this. The characters are very, very almost minimalistic, but the creators do some really, really interesting things with light and shadow in that book. But this is a very, very different look for this book, Russian Olive to Red King. And I think I know I like Russian Olive to Red King more than I liked Moving Pictures, which I liked quite a bit. In fact, I'll say that Russian Olive to Red King is probably one of my favorite reads of the year so far.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it really had a tremendous effect on me. I'm very much want a lot of people to read this. I liked it a lot.
Yeah, I saw on Goodreads that you really loaded it up with stars.
Yeah.
So, okay, how would you describe what goes on in Russian Olive to Red King?
The book really starts with a very, what appears to be a very simple scene. There's a man in bed with a woman, and the man is named Red, and that woman's named Olive, and he says, "Olive, why do you always wear black?" And she says, "Because I'm mourning for my life." And you would think that it's going to be a very, very heavy story from that point on, but not in the way that we get it. The woman, Olive, is taking a single propeller plane. She's being flown to northern Ontario, where she's going to do some research. And the pilot is named Rossi, and he's telling her this is pretty much the opposite direction to anywhere useful. But Olive is telling him, this is research that I'm doing. It's very important. And while she's gone, Red is left by himself. And this is not really much of a spoiler, but something happens to the pilot, Rossi. He either dies or he passes out and the plane crashes. And the rest of the book is a look at how both of these individuals get on with life. Now, Olive is still alive, but Red doesn't know it because he can't get any kind of, she can't call him. She's out in the wilderness trying to survive, and he's just trying to get by. Red is a writer, and his editor keeps giving him voicemails and calling saying, "I need the essay that you were going to give me. It's overdue. I need it. I need it now." And things get more dire for Red, and things get more dire for Olive as well, because she's out here in the wilderness. So I've told you probably more than I should tell you about the book, but the real emotional weight of the book comes from how they deal with these situations.
Yeah, no, I don't think you've said too much. I don't think you've given away any spoilers or ruined it for our listeners. Now, you'd mentioned that after Olive leaves and then there's the plane crash, then we see how each character moves on with their lives. And you're right, but we don't want to mislead readers. The narrative time in which the action takes place is very contained. Mm-hmm. So it's not like we get to see what Olive and Red are each doing individually over days, weeks, and months. Basically, it's within hours and days, really, because Red doesn't know for certain what's happened to Olive. But, I mean, even before he learns that something may have happened, he's doing things that he would normally go on to do. And in fact, maybe there are things that he wouldn't normally do, because we get a sense at the very beginning when they're in bed together, she says, don't do like you usually do. Get out of this house. Don't get lost inside of yourself. In other words, he's tasked with doing the things, the various chores and taking various trips to get things that she probably would normally do in the relationship. But Olive is also telling him to get out for his own good. Left to your own devices, you would just stay inside, not get out, not do much of anything. Get out, and see things, do things, and plus take care of what needs to be taken care of. So we see him doing that. And we see them doing it with their dog. The dog seems to be his only companion, and in fact, this story begins with the dog. Mm-hmm. The very first panel is this open door, and we see the dog's silhouette as he comes in one morning and puts his head, kind of like my dog, on his owner's bed and then jumps into the bed. Now, my dog doesn't jump into the bed. He's a big sheepdog, so we wouldn't have much room to sleep. But and then that's how this story begins. So you're right. Red does go about things after Olive leaves, and then we get to see Olive trying to survive and what she does in leaving the wreckage of the plane and trying to get by. Now, I love the way that the Immonens handle the storytelling here, because they go back and forth between Red and Olive, Red and Olive. And I think it's that kind of rhythm, this back and forthness of the storyline, what a film you may call cross-cutting, that is really what drives this story. Because if you think about it, outside of the plane crash, nothing really happens.
Right.
There's the crash, and then Olive trying to survive, but then Red doing, what he would normally do. Left by himself, where he had to do chores and, get badgered by his editor for that essay. So, I mean, there's not much action except in the narrative pacing and the way that the Immonens cut back and forth between those two characters. This book, though, takes an abrupt shift in the last, quarter, I would say? The last fourth of the book.
Yes.
Now
I want to talk about that too.
Yeah. This really caught me by surprise. Well, it did and didn't catch me by surprise. When I first got this book, I flipped through it. Again, it's a digital, so I was, scrolling through the pages, and I noticed that some of the final pages were very text heavy with little image. Mm-hmm. And then I moved to another page and I saw the same thing. And then I started to go through the last part of this book. It's like, my God, what is this? Is this a short story within a graphic novel? And it's the last quarter of Russian Olive to Red King is primarily prose. I mean, not strictly prose. You don't have a page of prose and that's it. But the prose, the words, the text overrides the image. And the image variety we get in this section, the last quarter, it's basically a series of broken windows. At first I wondered what this was, but then after a while you see enough of them, they're windows that are broken in various places, and you find out what these windows are actually from at the end of the book.
Yeah. And I really like the last portion of this book. Normally the prose element, if I'm reading a graphic novel that has tons of prose in it, like this, I usually am not really excited about that. And I know that there's a long history of that in comics, especially something famous like Watchmen. There are long stretches of prose. Usually for me, that's a turn off. But here, I think it's really, really essential. It's more like, sometimes those types of things are observations, more like a journal entry or something like that. But for me, this is a really, really essential part of the novel, graphic novel, because when Olive is trying to survive, she goes through this series of quotes. She quotes poetry. She quotes sections of literature. That's basically how she keeps going. We don't hear her say, "Oh, I hope Red is okay," or when I get back, I'm going to do this. She's constantly quoting things that she's read. It's how she keeps herself going. And the thing that's interesting about it is Red is a writer by profession, and that's how he gets his livelihood. But we don't see any hint of that throughout the story because he is, and one of the things is he's concerned that maybe Olive has left him. He doesn't really know what's happened to him, and that's the first thing that he thinks of. So we don't get any sense of what he is as a writer until we get to this prose section at the end, and it is just, to me, this was just emotionally staggering because this is Red writing. This is him putting his thoughts and his heart on paper. And to me, Derek, this was just like a knock in the head. I was just completely blown away by what he wrote.
I agree. And in fact, earlier I said that it was the last quarter of this book that is, I guess, Red's essay, the prose part. Actually, it's probably the last third. So, and this is in section, or I guess we get chapter 8, that we get this part, and it is titled For Olive. So he may think that she is dead, or at least has left him. So he's writing this for her, and this is a very moving story. And I have to say, when I first read it, or the first several pages of it, I didn't realize at first that this was Red who was writing this story because there's no clues as to that being the case. Now, had I put two and two together, I would have thought, oh, his editor is asking for an essay. This is turning out to be an essay. Of course it's Red. But it wasn't until I got into this story, and it's a story that you can really get into. Like you, it's funny because my background, my training is in prose fiction. So I should definitely not be turned off by long sections of prose in my comics. But like you, when I get a comic, I just don't expect those large concentration parts with heavy prose. And I thought, okay, well, they don't really hit me in the best way. Like sometimes when I've had to reread for whatever purposes Watchmen, I'll skip over the prose section. It's because, it's a comic and I just don't expect that much prose in it. And so when I first saw this, I thought, oh, really? The last third of this is, a short story? What is this? But very quickly I got into this, and then I started to realize this is Red. This is Red writing this. And, of course, that's why it was titled For Olive. And so I was really getting into it. This is a very moving story. Yeah.
And, Derek, this reminds me of a conversation that I have with one of my coworkers a lot, and about the power of graphic novels. And we've spoken before, she and I have spoken before about the graphic novel Stitches by David Small, and how that same story may have been effective as a prose story, and it may have been effective as a film, but neither of those would be as effective as what David Small did with the graphic novel element. There's just something about that format that makes that story work in a way that it wouldn't in any other format. Now, the thing that's really interesting about this is, Russian Olive to Red King works as a graphic novel, but there are so many things that we don't get about Red. We see him in these scenes, and we have a pretty clear idea of who he is as a character. But we don't get a crystal clear vision of who he is until we read those parts at the end. And and those are things that we would not grasp from the graphic novel by itself. Exactly. And when we get this is really Red taking a rich, honest, and sometimes painful look at his life that's really only hinted at in the graphic novel section of it. So the prose part of it just really makes him pop as a character.
Exactly. I mean, he is, when we see him in the first 2/3 of the book, he's a very quiet character. He's not someone who talks much at all. He doesn't share things. I mean, we get what's going on inside of him every now and again, but not near the amount of detail that we get in this last third of Russian Olive to Red King. It's as if with this prose section, with all of the broken glass panels at the bottom of the page, we're getting the insides of Red, the interior, the spirit of Red, that you really can't ferret out in the earlier 2/3.
Yeah. And had those things not had the prose section not been in there, I think it would still be a good graphic novel, but with the inclusion of that, it just takes it to another level.
Yeah. And we never do end up knowing what happens with Olive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I think that it's good that I've said before, I like ambiguity in my narrative, whether it be graphic novel or other forms. And I think we have this. In fact, I would say we have ambiguity out the wazoo in this book, because it's kind of hard to put your finger on what this book is about. If someone would ask me, okay, so what is Russian Olive to Red King about? I wouldn't know how to answer this. I feel like I'd have to think about it for a while, and then I'd probably spend about 5 minutes fumbling around in my explanation for whatever answer that might be. And that, in many ways, brings us back to some of the other books that we've been looking at with AdHouse. It's definitely the case with Popats, and in a strange way with Eric Haven's as well, is that these are comics storytellers who tell a story, who give us a section of a life or lives, but they're not necessarily wedded to the idea of a neatly tied up story. So they may not have coherent, nice, neat beginning, middles, and ends, but we get to see sections of individual lives in a variety of different ways. Now, I wouldn't put Ed Rugg into that category because, I mean, he's a different kind of comics artist. Especially in Street Angel, humorous stories, poking fun at certain genres and time periods. So he's playing a different game here. But I think that the kind of writing we see from the Immonens, very similar to what we find with Ethan Rilly.
Yeah, I would say so too. And I also want to mention too just a little bit about the artwork. There, anytime that we see Red, in fact, I think just about every time we see him in the graphic novel, except for one scene where he's going to exchange a gift, which I'd like to talk about that too. But there's great work with shadows and light with Red inside the house, and the contrast, especially the contrast with Olive being in the wilderness outdoors. Those contrasts are so vivid, and we see Red's growing desperation and isolation wonderfully rendered in that artwork. But I did want to mention that there is a wonderful scene where Red is going to a store, and he's returning a sweater that he had given Olive, or he was going to give Olive. I can't remember which. It was going to be a birthday gift. Right. And the scene is wonderful. He goes up to the counter, and the lady says, "What can I help you with today?" And he says, "I need to return. It's my girlfriend. I mean, a sweater I bought for my girlfriend. I ordered it online, but it said I could return it at the store." And he says, "I bought it for my girlfriend for her birthday." And she's holding it up, and she's looking at it, and she goes, "Good job. Does it not fit?" And he says, "I don't know." And she's holding it up and says, "Well, why don't you wait until she's able to try it on?" And he says, "I don't think so." And then she says, "Gee whiz, I wish my boyfriend had your taste." And he looks at her, and she looks at him, and then she realizes that something's not right. And then she just has a little smile at the end of it, like, this is really the only way I can close this transaction. But Red is, he's torn apart. And again, we don't really get how much he's torn apart until we get that prose section at the end.
And maybe she's smiling. That salesperson is smiling because she's thinking, hey, there's something wrong with that relationship. He has good taste. I wonder if he'll hit on me.
Maybe.
I mean, we don't know. I mean,
Yeah.
that's part of the ambiguity of their storytelling here. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah, I do too. This was a tremendous read, and definitely my favorite of the books that we looked at today.
Yeah, and listeners, you heard Andy say that so far this is about his favorite comic of 2015.
It's definitely in my top 10 so far of 2015.
Yeah. So, Andy, we started off by looking at Jim Rugg and Brian Maruca's Street Angel, the Pink Edition. After that, we discussed Eric Haven's and then issue number 4 of Pope Hats from Ethan Rilly. And then after that, Sophie Goldstein's The Oven, and we finished up with Kathryn and Stuart Immonen's Russian Olive to Red King, one of your favorites of the year so far.
Yep, that's a lot of books.
Yeah, and, I really do enjoy doing these publisher spotlights. The downside of doing a publisher spotlight is it's a lot of prep work, and you really have to prepare, so we need to make sure that we get the books early. So there's a lot of reading, but great books. We've never done a publisher spotlight where I feel that things were a little iffy. And what makes it possible are the publishers who help us out. And I want to thank Chris Pitzer not only for the interview, for taking a few minutes to talk with me the other day, but also in making sure that we get copies of this year's AdHouse releases and helping to make this show possible. I mean, really, I was about to say we couldn't do it without publishers, publicists, and whatnot. I guess we could. It would just be a little more difficult and a little more expensive for us to do so. So, Chris, thank you very much for helping to make this AdHouse episode possible.
Yes, Chris, thank you so much, and keep up the good work.
That's right. And if you want to pre-order future AdHouse books, you can do so by going to the website of our sponsor, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. So if you go to dcbservice.com, you'll find that it's the perfect place to pre-order your AdHouse books. And if you want to get some of these titles that we discussed on this week's episode, the books that are already out, then you can visit the website of their sister company, and that is In Stock Trades. And in fact, if you go to instocktrades.com, you'll see that you can get 25% off of Street Angel. So instead of paying $19.95, you'll get it there at $14.96. You can also find 25% off of Eric Haven's Instead of paying $14.95, it's only $11.21. And they have The Oven. You get 25% off that to pay as little as $9.71. So whether you go to In Stock Trades or Discount Comic Book Service, you can't beat their deals. It's a great place to get your funny books. And after you do get your comics there, get in touch with us and let us know what you think of our recommendations. You can get in touch with us by going to our website, comicsalternative.com, and in the right-hand side of your browser, click on the Send Voicemail tab, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can record a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very easy. But you can also call us the old-fashioned way. Our number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
And if you would like to keep up with what we're doing, you can get the latest news about things that are happening on the blog and the podcast by going to Twitter. And you can follow us there. We are the number 2 guys with PhDs. And we appreciate everybody who retweets our tweets.
Yes, and also you can communicate with us like Zach did and let us know of comics news via Twitter. You can also contact us via email. Our address is 2guys@comicsalternative.com. You can contact me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And Andy?
You can contact me at wolverton@comicsalternative.com.
You can also find us on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, and on Google+. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us through Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn, and you can find every one of our episodes as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary that we put up on our blog, and that's at comicsalternative.com.
That's right. You can't turn around without running into us.
That's right. And, I mentioned subscribing to us through iTunes. If you are on iTunes and you listen to the show, and I guess you do if you're hearing this right now, please do leave us a rating and review on iTunes. If you haven't already, we very much appreciate this. Obviously we like the 5-star reviews, but if you feel that we're only 4-star worthy, okay, that's on you. But at least leave us some kind of commentary. We'd love to hear from you. And I'm not exactly sure how this works, the metrics, the algorithm or whatnot. But apparently, the higher ratings we get and the more reviews we get gives us more exposure on iTunes searches.
Yep, that would be great.
Yeah, so every little bit helps, especially with our podcast, because if comics-related podcasts are a niche, we are a niche within the niche because we don't deal with the mainstream. We deal with the indie, the alternative, the stuff that probably most people who think about comics, such as Tara Schultz, do not think of as comics.
That's right.
Yeah, I had to get that little dig in. But we do appreciate your comments and getting in touch with us. So thanks for listening. Until next week, I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy.
And we will see you at Heroes Con.
What do you think?
It stinks.